Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. To be human is to form, to transform sensation into perception, perception into concept, concept into value, and value into identity. This is the function of the psyche. It does not merely reflect the world, it gives it shape through integration. The psyche is often misunderstood as a passive sum of its contents, thoughts, feelings, memories, impulses. But these are not the psyche. They are what the psyche does with experience. The psyche is the formative function that allows a person to make sense of himself and the world. Just as the body metabolizes nutrients into physical energy, the psyche metabolizes information into psychological coherence. It does this through differentiation, recognizing what is distinct or separate, integration, uniting what is connected or essential, abstraction, rising from the particular to the universal, valuation, organizing all experience by its meaning to the self. These are not optional functions. They are the conditions of selfhood. Without them, consciousness splinters. Thought becomes noise, emotion becomes flood, will becomes paralysis. The healthy psyche is not empty, as some may think or wish. It is ordered. The psyche is not only a space of experience, but a space of self-experience. Identity is not handed to us by the world. It is formed by how we respond to the world. At the center of the psyche is the ongoing question, who am I? But this is not answered by facts alone. It is answered through structure, the coherence of memory across time, the integration of values across conflict, the stability of will across choice. In this light, identity is a dynamic structure of form. A person becomes himself through the choices he makes and the patterns he upholds. The psyche, as the site of these choices and patterns, is where identity lives. In traditional models, emotion is treated as wild, involuntary, pre-rational. But in the One in the Many framework, emotion is understood as the form of evaluation, a rapid summary of meaning in response to perceived facts. Emotions are not random. They arise from the psyche's value structure, how it has formed judgments about what is good or bad, safe or dangerous, precious or trivial. When the psyche is integrated, emotions flow in proportion to values, and they inform rather than dominate action. When disintegrated, emotion loses its fidelity, either numbed, distorted, or overwhelming. The work of therapy, then, is not to release emotions arbitrarily, but to restore their rightful form, to reattach them to their cognitive roots and reintegrate them with the larger structure of the self. Psychological distress is not simply the presence of negative content. it is often the breakdown of form, the collapse of integration, the fragmentation of identity, the loss of coherence between thoughts, feelings, and actions. A person suffering from anxiety may be unable to form a boundary between potential and actual threat. A person experiencing depression may have lost the structure that links desire to effort or cause to effect. A person in dissociation may lack the structural continuity that holds memory, presence, and emotion in an integrated field. In each case, the healing process begins with reforming, re-establishing contours, links, rhythms, direction. In other words, the therapeutic task is not merely to treat content, but to restore the psyche's capacity to hold and shape experience with unity. A skilled psychotherapist is not only a guide through narrative or insight, they are a restorer of form. The therapeutic space itself is more formative. The structure of the session, start, middle, end, the stability of the relationship, the consistency of boundaries, the invitation to reflect, to name, to choose. All these elements serve the psyche's need for cohesion. The therapist does not give the client a new self. The therapist helps the client form it from within by connecting fragments into wholes, by clarifying what belongs where, by linking emotion to meaning and meaning to action. Healing is a reintegration of form. At its highest, the psyche is the site of principled unity. A person lives as the one in the many, not by denying complexity, but by integrating it, by giving form to contradiction, by making space for nuance, by holding multiplicity in a single volitional frame. This is what it means to flourish, to become increasingly able to shape one's experience into intelligible, intentional, and inspired form. The psyche is form itself, alive, ordered, expressive. To be psychologically whole is not to be free of conflict, it is to be able to hold the many within a conscious, living one. Man is the only creature that must choose to live. He is not guided by instincts but by values, abstract, consciously identified ends which he must act to achieve. His survival depends not merely on action, but on purposeful, value-driven action. This is the psychological root of motivation, and the philosophical virtue that sustains it is productivity. In the objectivist ethics, productivity is not merely about labor or output. It is the process of creating material values. And more deeply, it is the process of translating thought into reality. To be productive is to affirm one's capacity to shape the world by reason and effort. It is the spiritual counterpart of self-creation. The individual commits to act in service of life by transforming raw existence into valuable form. Ayn Rand defined productivity as the process of achieving values. The psychological correlate of this virtue is motivation, the energizing, goal-directed state of mind that sustains volitional action toward a valued end. Thus, the link between action and achievement is both ethical and psychological. The child must first learn to act. The adult must learn to act with purpose. And that purpose, when self-chosen and integrated, is what gives life its meaning. Motivation is not a feeling, it is a form of focus. It is the direction of attention, energy, and will toward the attainment of consciously identified value. The stronger the clarity of the value, the greater the strength of motivation. At its core, motivation is the psychological engine of human achievement. It is what allows a person to delay gratification, to overcome resistance, to persist through frustration and boredom in service of a larger aim. But motivation does not arise from nowhere. It arises from an integrated value structure. When one's values are disjointed or conflicted, motivation collapses. When they are integrated into a hierarchy consistent with reality and self-interest, motivation becomes resilient, even in the face of adversity. In childhood, motivation is simple and sensory. Pleasure drives exploration, pain teaches avoidance. But as the child grows, his goals become more abstract. He begins to pursue not just food and comfort, but approval, understanding, mastery. He begins to ask not only what do I want, but who do I want to be? This is the emergence of long-range motivation, a sustained pursuit of value that requires focus, effort, and identity. At adolescence, the stakes grow higher. The individual must choose his goals consciously. He must identify not only what he likes, but why. He must integrate his values into a worldview that supports action. This is the birth of purpose. Without this integration, motivation becomes reactive. The adolescent drifts, rebels, conforms. But when values are identified rationally and integrated hierarchically, he begins to act with direction and confidence. The transition to adulthood, then, is not simply biological, it is motivational. It is the assumption of responsibility for one's values and the consistent action to achieve them. The most crucial realization of an adult is that he is the causal agent of his own life. He is not an effect of society, nor a vessel of impulses, nor a leaf in the wind. He is a self-determined actor, and the extent to which he claims that agency, through volition, purpose, and productivity, is the extent to which he becomes himself. Volition is the power to focus the mind. Purpose is the structure that gives that focus direction. Productivity is the action that translates purpose into reality. To be motivated is to be alive in the full senses of the word. It is to wake up and know why you are doing what you're doing. It is to feel not only the satisfaction of effort, but the joy of moving towards something real. Motivation is ultimately linked with emotion, but not reducible to it. Emotions are evaluative signals, automatic responses that reflect the individual's implicit value structure. When motivation is aligned with long-range values, emotions reinforce it. Pleasure fuels effort. Pride crowns achievement. But when values are disintegrated, when a person is torn between the shoots of others and the aspirations of the self, emotions become sources of conflict. Shame, guilt, anxiety, confusion. These are not enemies, but measures pointing to disconnections between belief, value, and action. A therapeutic process based on integration does not suppress emotion, it interprets it. It asks, what value is being affirmed or denied here? What part of the self is speaking through this feeling? In this sense, motivation is clarified by understanding the structure of one's emotions. When motivation falters, it is not because the individual lacks discipline, it is because he has lost the link between action and value. This may result from lack of clarity about purpose, conflict between explicit and implicit values, disintegration between belief and behavior, trauma that erodes one's sense of efficacy, internalized moral inversions, for example, self-sacrifice is virtue. Restoring motivation, then, is a process of reintegration, identifying the values that matter most, realigning action with purpose, and rebuilding the confidence that my effort can lead to achievement. This is not just a clinical task, it is a spiritual one. It requires reawakening the individual's sense of agency and reaffirming that life is something one can shape through action. To work, to create, to build, to act toward a goal. These are not merely economic or pragmatic functions. They are existential affirmations. They express the fundamental premise, my life is worth the effort. When a person acts to achieve a value, he experiences himself as real. He sees himself mirrored in the outcome of his action. This is the essence of meaning, the connection between the self and the world through self-initiated transformation. A life without productivity is a life that drifts. A life of productivity, whether in learning, art, parenting, or career, is a life of self-definition. It is the arena where the one becomes manifest in the many. The process of integration culminates in the act of purposeful creation. The self, formed through differentiation and unified through integration, becomes an agent of form in the world. Through productive action, the individual expresses his deepest values in tangible form. He restores a garden, builds a business, writes a poem, raises a child. Each act is not only an achievement in the world, it is an achievement of the self. The one in the many becomes visible in the synthesis of mind and body, thought and action, purpose and achievement. This is the essence of a fulfilled human life, not merely to exist, but to create, not merely to act, but to act with meaning. The modern world moves constantly. It exhorts, energizes, mobilizes, and stimulates. It celebrates motion as progress and intensity as proof of life. Across education, work, politics, psychology, and self-help, the dominant cultural signal is clear. To be active is to be valuable. To be energized is to be advancing. Yet beneath this perpetual motion lies a growing sense of exhaustion, fragmentation, and instability, an unease that cannot be explained by lack of effort, opportunity, or information. The problem is not that people are insufficiently activated, it is that they are insufficiently formed. Contemporary culture has mistaken activation for development. It treats energy as primary and integration as optional, as though the capacity to mobilize feeling, attention, and action are equivalent to the capacity to become a coherent self across time. This inversion is subtle but critical. Activation is immediate and visible. Formation is slow and largely invisible. Activation excites, formation consolidates. One produces motion, the other produces continuity. When the former is elevated above the latter, cultures grow louder, faster, and more volatile, yet progressively less stable. In classical Athens, education was not organized around engagement or enthusiasm, but around judgment. The young were trained in grammar, music, and gymnastics not to excite them, but to discipline perception, emotion, and action into harmony. Philosophy was not motivational speech, it was a demand for integration between reason and appetite, private impulse and public consequence. The goal was not intensity, but measure. The Greek concept of sophrosine, self-command, moderation, proportion, stood as a cultural ideal precisely because unchecked energy was understood to be destructive rather than liberating. Rome, in its republican phase, advanced this principle further by binding formation to responsibility. Civic life was not an arena of self-expression, but for self-mastery under law. Authority was earned through demonstrated competence and restraint. The Roman ideal of gravitas signified weight of character, an internal density formed through duty, endurance, and continuity across generations. To act without formation was not celebrated as authenticity, it was condemned as immaturity. Passion without structure was not admired, it was distrusted. Medieval guild culture, though far removed from classical republicanism, preserved the same structural insight. A craft was not entered through enthusiasm, but through apprenticeship. Years of disciplined repetition preceded mastery. Identity followed competence, not the reverse. One did not declare oneself a master, one became one through accumulated integration of skill, judgment, and responsibility. Energy was present but subordinated to form. Time itself was the medium of transformation. What unites these disparate civilizations is not ideology, but architecture. Each recognized that becoming precedes acting well, and that formation is the invisible condition of freedom rather than its enemy. Stimulation existed, festivals, oratory, religious fervor, but it punctuated a formed structure. It did not replace it. Historically, civilizations that flourished understood formation as a central task. Education was not primarily about engagement, but about judgment. You can listen to my episode on judgment and mercy to get a sense of the role of judgment in the one in the many. Work was not primarily about motivation, but about competence and responsibility. Moral development was not equated with emotional expression, but with an earned capacity to act proportionately within a widening field of consequences. Stimulation existed, but it centered on already formed structure. It did not replace it. Modern culture collapses this distinction. Engagement substitutes for mastery. Motivation substitutes for integration. Expression substitutes for judgment. The individual is repeatedly energized, yet rarely assembled. This shift has been reinforced by the economics of attention. Systems that profit from visibility and immediacy reward intensity, novelty, and emotional polarization. What proliferates is differentiation without unity. Many signals, few integrations. Constant input, little consolidation. Knowledge accumulates, but understanding thins. Emotion intensifies, but calibration weakens. Agency becomes episodic rather than continuous. The result is not ignorance, but fragmentation under abundance, a condition in which the self is perpetually stimulated but seldom structured. One of the most damaging consequences of this cultural orientation is the flattening of development. Differences of psychological stage, integration capacity, and temporal horizon are ignored. Adolescents are pressured into adult stances without the integrations that sustain them. Adults are encouraged to remain in a state of perpetual reactivity. Mature adulthood, defined by consolidation, judgment, and long-range responsibility, becomes culturally invisible. What appears as vitality often conceals arrested development sustained by stimulation rather than resolved through growth. The moral cost of this flattening is profound. Formation is inseparable from responsibility. A formed self can delay gratification, accept causality, judge proportionally, and sustain commitments across time. A fragmented self cannot. Responsibility then feels oppressive rather than empowering. Judgment feels threatening rather than clarifying. And accountability is expressed as violence rather than structure. Cultures that erode formation must therefore erode judgment as well, or face constant internal conflict. The rejection of responsibility is not accidental. It is structurally necessitated by the absence of integration. Burnout emerges in this context, not as a personal failure, but as a cultural signal. It is the psyche's protest against sustained activation without corresponding growth. When energy is repeatedly mobilized without increasing coherence, effort eventually exceeds meaning. The system exhausts itself, yet cultures organized around activation misread this signal and respond with more stimulation, new techniques, new incentives, new narratives of motivation. The cycle tightens. Exhaustion is medicalized, individualized, or moralized, while the structural cause remains untouched. From the standpoint of the one in the many, this condition represents a civilizational imbalance. Energy has been liberated on a massive scale, but its direction has been lost. Activation has outpaced integration. The result is a society rich in motion and poor in becoming. Progress is measured by speed rather than continuity, by output rather than coherence, by expression rather than formation. Time itself loses moral weight, reduced to a series of energized moments rather than a medium of cumulative identity. The corrective is neither suppression of energy nor nostalgia for stillness. It is a reorientation of standards. The measure of progress is not how much energy a system can mobilize, but how much coherence it can sustain. Integration must reclaim its primacy. Formation must be recognized as the invisible architecture upon which all durable action depends. Silence, rest, and consolidation must recover their epistemic dignity, not as absence of movement, but as conditions of higher order continuity. The age of activation is not a moral failing so much as a transitional pathology, predictable in a civilization that has mastered stimulation without yet mastering integration. The task ahead is not to energize more, but to teach energy where to go. This requires developmental literacy, psychological architecture, and institutions designed not merely to activate individuals, but to form selves capable of sustaining meaning, responsibility, and agency across time. Only then does motion become progress and activity become life. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.